I want to see queer people telling their own stories, and I want to see more contemporary love stories with the money to back it. I think some rom-coms couldn't hurt. I think also I want to see more queer parents represented on television, especially gearing towards a younger audience. I think it's important to give kids that kind of representation.
I would love to see more bisexual relationships. I want to see them in a way where they're not so complicated and they're not based off of secrecy and infidelity, and they're just based off of actually just existing in a very normal way. I just want to start watching a project and they just exist. They just exist. Yeah, that'd be cool.
More joy. I think we've all been through so much trauma, and trauma has been so centered in queer stories for so long that I'm really excited to experience the joy more than I experienced the pain.
I want LGBTQ representation that is from the Caribbean, that is Puerto Rican, that is Dominican, that is Cuban, that is Haitian, right? Like, I want stories of our ancestors, right? Like LGBTQ folks in the diaspora, but also like pre-colonization. What did it look like to be queer back in the day, right? Like before Columbus, before the Spanish-American War, right? I want queer stories that are period pieces from our histories. I want the Arawak version of like, you know, the Crown or the Borgias, like big stories.
I always want to see more stories of trans folks of color, trans folks living and thriving and making it through this world and loving and having friends in a community. I want to see stories of queer families. I am a queer trans man who grew up with 2 moms, and I haven't seen a lot of stories like that on screen.
The people making the decisions to choose that story, to produce the story, to create a narrative not only on screen but off screen, also need to be from the designated community in which we are trying to tell that story from. We can have people that look like a certain way in front of the camera, and millions of people are going to identify with that person, and then they feel seen. But to make an everlasting change, to make a legitimate change, an authentic change to the DNA of the project and of the story being told, representation matters outside too. Behind camera. Writing the story, producing the story, choosing the soundtrack, creating the soundtrack.
I would love to see content for young people that deals with queerness, that teaches them about queerness. Things like what Nina West is doing on her socials or the TV show she's making. I would love to see, you know, a network sitcom about queer people, or even like a network crime drama. Everybody loves those, but with a queer person at the lead. All of these things that we've grown up with, that we haven't seen ourselves in, I want to start seeing ourselves in them.
I would love to see more queer characters who are in positions of power. So I want to see like transgender presidents. I want to see, you know, gay superheroes, more gay superheroes. I want to see bisexual like astronauts. I don't know if that counts, but I want to see more LGBTQ characters in positions of power. I want queers to run the world. And until that happens, I'm just not gonna be happy.
As a trans woman, a Black trans woman, and as an actress, I think it's so important that we really highlight the stories of queer people of color. Our stories are so rich and so fulfilling, and they're so important. And for me, I want to tell the stories of the trans women that I knew growing up. My foremothers, the ones that helped me to become the woman that I am today. And also I want to tell the stories of my life experiences and that I think the world never gets to hear.
A little bit more of class diversity in queer art. I think especially in stories about gay men, we see a lot of wealthy gay men or just no discussion of money at all, and I don't think that reflects the realities of living as a queer person. So I would love to see a little bit more of a class consciousness come through in queer art.
I want to see
just every possible queer story told. The good, the bad, and the ugly. I want queer good guys, queer bad guys, queer anti-heroes. I want queer people to be shown as human and as people, and I think a big part of that is showcasing our depth and dimension and the infinite possibilities that come with that.
More centered stories, a variety of our centered stories, because we're not a monolith and there's such a range of experiences. And equally, I want to see those characters in the center of the stories have flaws and be vulnerable and mess up and have hopes and dreams like all the other centered characters that we've had access to.
I want to see more in terms of the diversity of storytellers, more in terms of diversity of the kinds of stories we're telling about the LGBTQ community that go beyond the coming out. And when you do a quick Google search of like famous LGBTQ movies, I mean, it's still largely white and male. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Everybody wants to see themselves reflected on screen, small or independent or on any scale. And I think as long as we continue to de-romanticize the politics of what being queer is and what being gay is and what being trans is and what being non-binary is, we can continue to see the world shift and progress.
Love stories from our queer brothers and sisters being told that don't end in tragedy, that end up in a good note and uplifting and aspirational for anyone who's young and watching television or film can see themselves represented and that there is a future for them. That would be an amazing world to live in.
Diversity, diversity, diversity. I feel like we keep talking about this every year till we're blue in the face. Hashtag representation matters, but it's true. There's no one way to be queer. There's a wealth of stories and experiences to draw from our community, and I feel like our art should reflect that. Whether it's music, visual arts, TV, movies, what have you, it should look like the world that we live in. Our flag is a rainbow, after all. It's not white.
Yeah, I'd love to see more stories about older LGBTQ people, older adults and seniors. I think I've seen recently this really great reclamation of our history, and that's, in works of nonfiction and documentary, we're going back and we're telling the stories of members of the LGBTQ community that have been infuriatingly sort of silenced and coded and erased from history. But one thing that I think I've seen a lot less of is telling the stories of some of those folks who went through those struggles in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, but are still here today living their lives as LGBTQ seniors and older adults. And I would love to see not just documentaries, but series and dramas about those people as well.
I want to see more LGBT art that shows us queer communities in cities that aren't just New York. I recently watched the show It's a Sin, and I fell in love with that show, not just because it was an incredible story, but because it centered a group of queer people living in London in the 1980s. It's a place and a time period that I just didn't know much about, especially with regards to queer people. And I know for a fact that there are queer communities around the world in all sorts of cities, big and small, urban and rural, that have been there for each other. And they have incredible stories that I and other people definitely want to hear.
We have been making art forever. We're good at it. We're good at doing it indie. We're good at making it work, but we don't have to. And yeah, we've been making strides in this area, but I want big budget franchises helmed by queer characters, led by queer directors. I want the actors to be queer. I want non-binary actors who are household names. I want trans folks who are heartthrobs. I just want queerness.